talked about evolution, the key point, the one that's easy, simple, and it's good to remember, and it's good to challenge believers of evolution with. The theory of evolution says that there is an unguided, uncontrolled, accidental process that led from the first thing that could make copies of itself to the whole envelope of life that we see on the planet. Now, you have a situation in front of you and you want to know, where did it come from? How did it get there? And somebody says it got there through a process that was unguided, uncontrolled, and accidental. The first thing you need to know in order to make up your mind whether to accept that idea or not is, what is the probability that the process being described would give rise to this outcome? If the probability is high enough, then you might accept it as adequate. If the probability is shockingly low, then you will not accept it as adequate. Somebody flips a coin 3 times in a row and gets heads 3 times in a row, and he says it was by accident, nothing controlled it or forced it to be that way. That's easy enough to accept. It happens 12.5% of the time. Somebody flips a coin 200 times in a row, gets 200 heads in a row, and he says it was by accident. I think we are going to reject that because the probability is just too low to say that it was by accident. Could happen. 1 over 2 to the 200th power. But that's very, very unlikely. And we're going to say it's controlled somehow. Now, suppose somebody says, well, I flipped the coin n times and it came up n times in a row heads. Believe me or not. What we want to know is, what's the value of n? 2, 16, 104, 1,000? What's the value of this? I'm not telling you. I'm not telling you. Just want to know whether you accept it or not. The obvious response is, you haven't given me enough information to make up my mind, because if you don't tell me the number of flips, I can't calculate the probability if it's happening by accident. Evolution is in exactly that position. They do not give us an estimate of the probability that evolutionary processes would develop the life that we see. You don't give me an estimate of the probability, so then just not appropriate to make up our minds whether to accept it or to reject it. Again, I'm not arguing that it's false. I'm just arguing there certainly isn't enough reason to accept it as true. One ought to just honestly confess with ignorance. I gave you the example yesterday of an object which has an X on one side. You throw it into the air 3 times, comes out an X 3 times in a row. If I don't tell you how many sides the object has, then you can't compute the probability, in which case there's not enough information to make up your mind whether it's true or false. Yeah.
I'm not sure that looking at it from like a probability standpoint is the best way to look at it, because there's sort of like there's evidence in like the fossil record of animals being like the older animals as they progress in the fossil record, sort of being more similar, and then there's the in-between, the intermediary animals between the animals that we see today. And like the fact that the evidence is there, it sort of it's very consistent with like what evolution sort of says. And I don't really understand, like I guess, do you have another way of explaining it, like that, like God sort of facilitated the mutations? Because there's like good evidence that there's like a timeline of change in animals that are very similar to each other.
Okay, let me, I mentioned Ernst Mayr yesterday, and he has a wonderful article in which he describes 5 different meanings for the word evolution. 5 different meanings, which, as you could anticipate, causes some confusion. When somebody talks about evolution, he needs to tell you what he means. If he doesn't tell you what he means, then you can get into confusion. And I'd like to describe them to you. But the short answer to you is this. You're describing the succession of life forms. Let's agree to that. Let's agree that the succession of life forms is exactly the way the fossil record shows. That's not what I was discussing. What I was discussing is a particular explanation of how those life forms got to be that way. What was the cause that made them that way? What caused them to develop in that way? The fossils don't tell you that. The fossils do not tell you that. The fossils don't give you any clue as to what the cause was that made it that way. The idea that there's DNA and there's random mutations in DNA and that's the cause of the development of life that way is not in the fossil record. There isn't one whit of evidence in the fossil record that it is random changes in DNA and then selection that caused the life forms to develop in that way. So I'm talking about something that's independent of the fossil record. Fossil record doesn't play one way or the other on this. So now we want to know, given the fossil record that describes the order of life forms, what's the probability that that was caused by random variation in the DNA plus selection? That's what I want a probability for.
I guess it's easier for me to sort of see that it's possible for these mutations to take place, just sort of looking at like humans in the world, like the humans in the warmer climates have darker skin, the humans in the colder climates with less sun have lighter skin, and that makes sense because the different light that humans need to survive. And if I was in like living in the hot climates, I'd like, be sunburned all the time if I walked outside. Yeah. And then there's also like the thing about, I think there's in general like people like I think it was like the Aztecs in Mexico like tended to have like shorter arms than other humans around the world because they were living at altitude, and their shorter arms made it more efficient for them to run out at altitude and sort of hunt their prey and sort of get along. And so if you sort of look at it from like an environment standpoint, like if you look at like there's some people just like born darker than others even though their parents are lighter skinned, and these changes happen. You can sort of see them in our lifetime. Like basketball players have longer wingspans, longer arms compared to other people, and you can see these sort of slowly, how these can slowly sort of progress. I think you sort of said, you described evolution as one step at a time. You sort of like, yeah, there's a mutation, and then every 1,000 humans there's a mutation, every 1,000 mutations there's a mutation that's positive. But I don't think you necessarily have to look at it that way. I think you can say there's a mutation, and maybe that's positive or negative, but depending on where it happens in the world and the environment that the person is in, it's either helpful. Like if it's helpful to have shorter arms at higher climates because you can run better, and maybe it's not so in jungle climates where I don't know where it's not true.
Well, I think almost everything that you said is correct, but I don't think it cuts the ice with respect to the issue. First of all, you used the word at the beginning of your remarks, which I want to pull out and put on display for a moment. You spoke about it being possible. Now, as you remember from 2 weeks ago when we started this series, I gave away possible for everything. Leprechauns are possible also. Anything's possible. I said over and over again, what we're talking about today is probability, number one. Number two, all of the mutations that you are describing, I'm not going to admit that they're mutations, but even if they were mutations, are intra-specific. They're all within a species. You have no direct evidence whatsoever of mutations accumulating so as to cross the line from one species to another. Now you say, well, if I can observe small mutations, why can't I just imagine? Imagine that they pile up and accumulate. Well, you can certainly imagine that. I'm not questioning the power of anybody's imagination. But from the fact that you have small scale effects, you don't automatically get large-scale effects. Here's an example, a gross example. Then I'll quote Stephen Jay Gould for you. Ants are really remarkable. Many ants can carry up to 8 times their own weight, each one. And hundreds of them build fantastically complicated anthills and tunnels and passages under the ground. And they work together as armies to fight each other and defend and so forth and so on. Hundreds of ants together. Well, I have a theory about the pyramids. I think the pyramids were built by trillions of ants working together. After all, if hundreds can do it, then thousands can do it. If thousands can do it, then millions can do it. If millions can do it, then billions can do it. If billions can do it, then trillions can do it. I think at that point, someone's going to say, wait a minute. There's no evidence for millions doing it. There's no evidence for thousands doing it. All the evidence we have is for some hundreds. To expand to trillions is just to go way beyond the evidence that you have. So the first thing one would have to look for is documented cases where there are accumulations of mutations that lead to at least a change from a species to another. Now, that's been going on for a long time. And there are at least 50 claims of such cases taking place, and every one of them has been shown to be incorrect. So, and for example, what some people have done is take bacteria. Bacteria can reproduce in 20 minutes, so you can get millions of generations. You don't have to wait billions of years to get millions of generations. You can get them over a couple of decades. And this has been done. And never has a new species of bacteria appeared with all the changes in environment, the changes in conditions, so on and so on. They haven't evolved resistance to certain types of lethal conditions. And they have evolved no new species. So some work has been done on this. Fruit flies, which have been experimented now systematically for 60, 70 years, they have not been able to produce a new species. And when they claim species, they're often wrong. For example, the Galapagos finches that Darwin was supposed to have studied, he didn't really, but he was supposed to have studied them, and the beaks change and so forth and so on. Well, recent studies have shown that all those groups interbreed. And if they interbreed, they're all the same species. So it was not speciation at all, simply variation in beak size. Variations in beak size can be a matter of different expression of the same DNA. It doesn't have to be any selection at all. The same DNA can express itself differently in different environment and different conditions and the need for different behaviors. So all of this, even if I admitted that it was mutations, there's no evidence whatsoever that mutations can take you beyond the limits of a species. And some of the claims that it is mutations is simply not correct. One study that was done, and this will give you a taste for the literature, there was a claim that new species of bacteria were produced in a quite short time in a laboratory in the following way. They took a single bacterium and let it multiply in a medium, which means since it's a single bacterium multiplying, presumably you get all the same DNA. And then they took the liquid medium and they changed the temperature. Made the temperature warmer at the top, intermediate in the middle, and colder on the bottom. And after a number of generations, they changed their forms quite dramatically. Different sizes, different shapes, different appendages, and so forth and so on. And this was written up, and the people who are looking desperately for evidence for evolution said, here you have the appearance of new species of bacteria in the laboratory in a fairly short period of time. When they reported that, what they failed to do is read to the end of the paper, or they failed to report the end of the paper. The end of the paper says, however, when we restored uniform temperature to the entire medium, they all went back to the old type. Well, by definition, if it's a question of selection, when you change them into the environment backwards, they don't revert to the old type. In species of bacteria, one of the definitions of finding a new species is that it shouldn't revert back to the old type. It should be a permanent change. So it isn't an example of it. There are no documented cases where the accumulation of mutations leads to the appearance of a new species. So at that point, I say, what you are showing me is evidence of small-term changes. The extrapolation to millions of them leading to large-scale changes is extrapolation without evidence.
I don't see why it's not like why if you go back to the other environment, the bacteria wouldn't revert. I don't see why you say why they wouldn't revert, because the bacteria was that way in the other environment because it was better, and so why wouldn't the species revert?
Because typically changes in DNA are one way. The whole idea of evolution is that you have random changes which are set in the DNA because of the environment. You're better off in that environment. You don't undo old changes. You may add new changes, but you don't undo old changes because they're set in the DNA. The DNA isn't constantly being destroyed and repaired.
But if
I mean, that's their definition. You can look it up in the literature. That's their definition. The definition of the people working in biology, and they said it themselves at the end of the paper. This does not constitute finding new species because we reverted back to the old environment. They changed back to the old forms. It's probably selective expression of DNA rather than the appearance of a new species. Nobody documented the changes in the DNA. Nobody actually took apart the DNA and showed where the mutations were and how the mutations took place. Nobody did that. They just saw the new forms. Seeing the new forms and having them revert is no evidence that you've created a new species through mutation. So the evidence isn't there. So what you have to say is, if I see little changes, what's the probability that millions of them could make big changes? I don't know, and you don't know either, because we don't have any cases where it's happened. Maybe it's impossible, just like with fruit flies, where they kept experimenting by changing the shape of the wing and the structure of the wing, and then after a while, enough changes got accumulated, they just died out, and they couldn't keep reproducing.
But what about like animals that can have sterile offspring, like donkeys and horses? Like they're extremely similar, and like to the normal person they look very similar, but they're not the same species.
Only the people who haven't lived with them. No one who's lived with donkeys and horses would ever mistake one for the other. But anyway, so what? They actually have mules. So what should I conclude from that?
Well, I think it can show that they can be so close to each other that they can still have offspring, but the offspring is just not.
Let's say so. But then for the non-reproducing criterion of species, by the way, there are at least 10 ongoing popular definitions of species. And the honest biologists write that when we're facing a problem of describing a group, we use the definition which is most useful in the context. Now, for sexually reproducing organisms, the normal definition is whether they can interbreed or not. If you can interbreed, what you produce is sterile offspring, you have a kind of gray area case. It isn't discussed, but one ought to think, if reproduction is one of the key elements of life, are mules alive? Are they alive? They can't reproduce. So are they alive? Another gray area. But so if you talk about reproductive isolation, some groups we define them as separate species because they can't reproduce at all. Here's something that reproduces, but the offspring are sterile. So it's a gray area. But what am I supposed to conclude from that? Things are similar enough, they reproduce and they continue the line. Other things are reproductively isolated. This is sort of half isolated and half not. There are lots of different relationships between species, and some give rise to sterile offspring. I don't see what that has to do with whether or not mutations can accumulate so as to cross a species line. That's still up for grabs. What is the proponent here saying? He's saying, since random change of the DNA and selection isn't enough, there must be some other mechanism or mechanisms that are playing a role in the development of life, whatever they may be. The first thing is just a negative attack. And I don't have to provide God as an answer. I'm just asking, is this theory well enough established to be accepted as true? Well, if you have no probability whatsoever of its being the cause of the entire result, then I think one ought to be open-minded and say, we don't know if it's the cause of the result. We should be open-minded and look for other causes. And by the way, other causes have been found. Epigenetics is a whole industry today, especially the Evo-Devo, the genetics of development, which depends a lot on epigenetics.
I don't know.
Epigenetics means that the development, there are two things going on. Number one, there are events in the cell that turn on and off the DNA selectively, so that the DNA, some parts function and some parts don't. You know that. How come you have muscle cells, and neurons, and red corpuscles, and so forth and so on? They all have the same DNA. How come they look so different and function so different? Answer, because not all the DNA is active all the time. Something's masking part of it and letting part of it operate, and the DNA has the capacity, when masked in certain ways, to produce a red corpuscle that carries oxygen, and then masked another way, and other parts of it are active, produce a neuron, and masked another way, produces a muscle cell, all with the same DNA. So obviously something's determining what parts of the DNA express themselves and what parts don't. And it turns out that there are environmental feedback mechanisms that do that. So even if you think, and it's only a thought, that the environment can't affect the DNA directly, it can certainly affect the way the DNA operates. So then you can have changes in expression that have nothing to do with mutation at all. There are plants that you plant them at different altitudes and they grow in different ways, different number of leaves, different way in which they develop. Exact same DNA. You take seeds from exactly the same plant, you plant them at different altitudes and they grow in different ways. Just now there's a type of flower which has two forms. Linnaeus discovered this and gave it a name. Gave it a name in Latin, which means monster, because as against the regular form, it's kind of distorted and monstrous. It has been established now that it's only an epigenetic difference. The DNA is identical in the two forms. So you look at them and you'll say, it's got to be different. They're so different the way they appear, but it isn't true. There's no change in the DNA whatsoever. So there are other things that are going on that lead to the way in which the cell behaves. Some of them are sensitive to the environment. There have even been documented Lamarckian inheritance. That is to say, something happens to an organism and it passes on the result of that to its offspring just because of what happened to it. Because there are elements in the cell which carry their own information other than DNA, and they can be affected by the environment. And when they reproduce in the new organism, they carry on those changes. So there's a lot more going on than what the Orthodox Darwinian picture allowed. And this has a kind of double effect. So there's a much richer fund of information in the cell than just the DNA. There is a lot more flexibility for change to take place. So maybe, indeed, these changes are really natural, and they're just based on other mechanisms than just the DNA. Good, good. That would be helpful to at least some naturalistic picture or other, whether it's Orthodox Darwinian or not. But then, of course, what you're faced with is a cell that's much more complex than you thought, has many more powers of determination and development and response than you thought, which makes the project of explaining how you got to that multifaceted cell much harder to determine. A number of years ago, about 8 years ago, a book was published called Evolution in 4 Dimensions by two Jewish women, in fact. One's name was Jablonka, and the other one, published by MIT Press. I can't remember the other one's name. Very interesting book, by the way. To give it credit, political credit to the United States of America. This is a book on evolution. They're both scientists. At the end of each chapter, they have a section called Epigenetics. I wager you don't know what that means. That's a quotation from the Talmud. Epigenetics means it would be more logical to take the opposite point of view. And they consider objections to every chapter in that section. Now, they took that phrase from the Talmud. They're both Jewish women. I think maybe even they're religious. And they put that in as answering the objections that could be raised. But their point was precisely that the Orthodox Darwinian view can't carry the ball because a lot more is going on than mere changes in DNA can account for. So, by the way, there's a website now called The Third Way, a collection of leading researchers who say, we don't believe that the Orthodox Darwinian way is correct. We have no truck with creationism at all. We're atheists. We don't believe in religion. But we see that the Orthodox Darwinian way is not adequate. Well, then we've got to look for something else. And they're publishing papers themselves and gathering papers from other sources, which indicate other approaches to the development of life. You can look it up, The Third Way. So there's a lot going on. I'll just say the evidence from mutation is evidence only for small-scale changes. And to extrapolate that into, where's the whale supposed to come from? The whale is supposed to come from some small, furry animal ancestor about the size of a fox. How many stages would you like to place between something like a fox and a whale? 6? 16? 106? 600? So you read about these phenomenally convincing papers that there are bones in the whale which look like the leg bones of land animals. So that shows you that they're definitely coming from foxes or something like a fox. I'm frankly unconvinced. I think that there's a lot of space between finding bones which might or might not be really like the leg bones of a fox to make the gap from a fox to a whale. Let me tell you, since we're working on this, you've heard of the idea that the dinosaurs aren't dead? Dinosaurs didn't die out? We're surrounded by their descendants. The birds are the descendants of the dinosaurs. Right? Certain dinosaurs evolved into birds, and they are the result of the dinosaur line, what's left of it. Well, as a matter of fact, this is immensely controversial. And every 4 or 5 years, it goes up and down. And people are convinced that it's true, and then they're convinced that it's false. I have, on my website, an article by a fellow named Larry Martin. Larry Martin is one of the world's experts on birds of the fossil record. And he was examining the relationship between dinosaurs and birds. The proponents of the connection cited 85 anatomical features in common between dinosaurs and birds. 85. That's a lot. 85 features in common? That's really convincing. That's really convincing. Okay? He writes, I did a detailed investigation of all 85, and virtually none of them is accurate. None out of 85. Now listen, I don't pledge allegiance to either side, but golly, if one set of experts say they have 85 proofs, and the other says you have 0, something's desperately wrong. Something's desperately wrong. The methodology can't be trusted. He says such poor attention to detail in every case means that the whole thing is without support. I say a pox on both your houses. You're both shooting the breeze. You're both whistling in the wind. If you can disagree to that extent, then this field is open. There's no reason to draw any conclusions. Maybe yes, maybe no, but certainly not to pledge allegiance. And there are many, many studies of this kind. At any rate, I'm just to summarize the idea of mutations. We are aware of mutations, though they are exaggerated. There are cases where there are changes which they say are mutations, and they don't know that they're mutations. They do not know that they're mutations. I'll give you another example in a moment. And even if they were mutations, they're always small scale. They're always small scale. Indeed, it has been documented. Let's take bacteria. Everybody knows the bacteria change because they become resistant to antibiotics, right? Okay, what does that mean? You're in hospital, you're using the antibiotics, and at one time the antibiotics are phenomenal. They wipe out the infection and just wipe it out. And then little by little, the antibiotic becomes less and less effective, and in some cases it doesn't work at all. In some cases it makes it much longer. By the way, antibiotics don't do the whole job. The autoimmune system in the body also does some. The antibiotics help. They help. They make it faster. They make it easier. Sometimes it takes longer. In some particular cases it doesn't work at all. What happened? Well, the story they tell you is that the bacteria evolved to become immune to the antibiotic. Well, maybe yes and maybe no. You really can't tell that unless you have the DNA of the original and the DNA of the later, and see that they're different, and see how the antibiotic can attack the original and not the second. If all you have is a change in the power of the antibiotic, there's another hypothesis. The other hypothesis is that the original population of bacteria wasn't uniform. It had its own built-in variations. There was a small minority of the original population which was immune to the antibiotic, but because it was 0.5%, if the antibiotic killed out 90% of the bacteria and the autoimmune system killed out the rest, the infection went away. Now, the antibiotic is successful in killing all but the 0.5%. They then multiply more than the others. They take up more and more of the population, and eventually the antibiotic becomes less and less powerful because it's now facing an increased population of the original ones that were immune. That's another explanation. You don't know that it's a variation in selection. You don't know that it's evolution. You don't know that. The only way you could know that, and this has been done in a couple of cases, but this is not the newspaper reports. The only way you could do it is similar to what I said before about evolving species. Take a single bacterium, grow it in a culture, and then after a while, introduce an antibiotic and see if it kills half of them and the other half survive, then you know a change has taken place. Because if it were the same DNA, then either they would all die or they all wouldn't die. So if you do have that differential effect, so then you could say, we know some change has taken place. Now that has happened in a couple of cases. And then they did a study of the DNA. They looked at it carefully and in detail, and they checked exactly how the change in the DNA conferred immunity. In all cases that have been investigated, the answer is the following. The antibiotic disrupts the functioning of the bacterium by attaching to a certain portion of its DNA and stopping its function. And when it does that, the bacterium can't function. What happens when the bacterium becomes immune to the antibiotic is this: that portion of the DNA breaks. So when the antibiotic looks for that point of attachment, it can't attach because that part has broken. Since that part is broken, it can't attach, and the rest of it functions fine. It means if you break a piece of the DNA, something isn't quite as good as it was before, but it's good enough to multiply in your bloodstream and cause fevers and stuff and so on. Every case that's been documented has been the following: that when you get immunity, and therefore you get an increased adaptation or ability to survive and reproduce, it's always through a loss of information. Never a gain in information, but a loss of information. Always through a loss of function. Now, here you have a beautiful two-edged sword. Does it show you that genetic change can confer greater adaptation? Yes. In particular, immunity against human antibiotics. Is this a model for genetic change leading to the development of life? Surely not. Because the genetic changes that are necessary for the development of life require adding information, not subtracting information. What we really need to see is genetic changes that create new information that's useful. In all the cases that are documented so far, it only creates loss of information, which is useful because it blocks the antibiotic that wants to attach, and it can't attach there anymore. So, does it show that genetic change can help? Sure, but not the kind of help that you need to explain the development of life. Now, as you can begin to understand, I told you 2 days ago, this is like studying the Talmud. The question, the concepts are in flux, and the rules are in flux, and the experiments are in flux, and you have to read it in some detail to get some sense of what's going on, what isn't going on. And the New York Times Science Supplement will not do it for you. I could recommend places to go to read, but you'll probably think they're prejudiced, so it probably won't be worthwhile. But I've gotten a great deal of information from a wide variety of sources, and I can tell you that the arguments that are made in favor are simply not adequate to draw a conclusion that it's correct. Yeah.
Okay. This is kind of taking like an outside view, and I mean it most respectful way. I don't want it to be insulting, but does evolution contradict Jewish beliefs?
Okay, so now this is, I guess we didn't speak about this. This is a very important question. I mean, I usually start with this, but I wanted to get to the scientific stuff. It depends upon where you're looking for Jewish beliefs. If you are looking at the text of Genesis, which is very short, very vague, very general, you needn't think that there's a contradiction. What you could always say is, except for the creation of man, but for everything else, you could say evolution is the appearance of what God was really directing. God is hiding behind, and he's giving the appearance. The theory of evolution describes the order of events, even if I include mutations as the order of events. But when the theory of evolution says that the mutations are random, then it's assigning a cause for the mutations. That's beyond its province. It has no direct evidence that they were random. All it can say is, we could assume that they're random and get the same result. Well, you can make assumptions. It's a free world. You can make any assumptions you like, but it doesn't mean the assumptions are right. A religious person could say, and certain Christian groups do say this, could say, yes, the world presents the appearance as if evolution were true, but the fact is that God guided it in a way that wasn't open on the surface. And that way, you wouldn't have an absolute contradiction. That would be good if you're dealing with the text of Genesis. But we aren't dealing with the text of Genesis. We're dealing with an entire tradition, which includes the sum total of the oral tradition and all the books of the prophets that come after the text of Genesis. And if you take the tradition as a whole, that's not going to wash. That's not going to wash. Because there are many, many statements in the tradition as a whole which don't allow it to take that picture. In particular, the amount of time is something which we cannot tolerate. And everybody knows that 5,700 years is not enough time for evolution. And of course, the creation of man is completely off the books. It says explicitly that God formed his body and God blew into his nostrils a soul of life. And that's an act of special creation, not like, for example, the animals where God said to the earth, call forth the animals. If you wanted to, you could say that's poetry for a natural process or seemingly natural process that looks natural. I wouldn't feel that was grossly undermining the text if you said that particular text. But with man, you can't say that. The man is a direct, specific human, divine activity giving rise to the first human.
What does it say exactly? I'm sorry.
It says in chapter 1, verse 26, it says, let us make man in our own image, after our own likeness, shall rule over the God created, man in his image, the image of God who created him, male and female. Him, he did it, not from the earth like all the other ones. And in chapter 2, it says, and Hashem God formed man of the dirt of the ground, and he blew into his nostril the soul of life, and man became a living being. Now that is direct, specific creation of a single creature. It is not, let the earth bring forth animals, let the seas bring forth birds and fish. It's not like that at all. It's not described that way at all. There, I think, to say that it's the seemingly natural result of an evolutionary process is just not possible, even with the text of Genesis.
Okay, I just don't know what that means. By he blew into him a soul, and I don't know if you could argue that this was just the means of God expressing it through evolution. That meant as well.
Well, there is a sentiment, especially at Yale University, that no text means anything. Texts are just available for you to spin out your imagination and associate it with it any way you like. It's called postmodernism or deconstructivism. And that means that nothing carries any meaning of its own. Any person or any group can interpret it any way it likes, and that being the case, that's the reality of the text for them. We could talk about that at length if you like. I think that's intellectual suicide. No one would do that with a contract in law. No one would do that with a love letter. No one would say that you can interpret it as you like. My example is this. You have a contract and it says every month, the 15th of the month, you will pay $5,000 to the corporation. Fine. Every month you come in with $5,000, month after month after month. In June 15th, you come in with a box. And the recipient for the corporation opens it up and he sees 5,000 monopoly dollars. So he said, oh, very funny. Where's my money? I said, there's your money. What are we talking about? That's not money. It's monopoly dollars. So, but the contract is talking about American legal tender. Where does it say that? Where does it say so? Show me where it says American legal tender. It doesn't say that. It says $500. The guy says, but it's got to be $500 American dollars. So this monopoly set was made in America. It's 500 American monopoly dollars. Where does it say different? That's not even a joke. That's just dumb, right? Texts aren't just whatever you like to make out of them. Texts aren't free for your interpretation. I had this argument with Christians once, Jewish boys who got involved in Christianity. They said, the tree of life in the Garden of Eden is the founder of Christianity. I said, really? Golly, why do you say that? And they said to me, well, don't you say that the Torah is a tree of life? Aren't you also associating a Torah with a tree? So I said, sure, because those words, the Torah is a tree of life, is a quote from the same book. I can use one part of a book to interpret another part of the same book, but to incorporate an idea from the outside, which has no reference in the book whatsoever, if you do that, then the sky's the limit. Maybe the tree of life is Zeus. Maybe the tree of life is butterflies because they're very beautiful. Maybe it's radioactive radium. Who knows? You can say any whatever you like. Then you're down the road with the deconstructionists who are just intellectual suicide. When you interpret a text, there has to be something in the text that you base it on. The meaning of the word, the context, the use of the word in other passages. But just to associate it because it's convenient for you, that's just abandoning the text altogether. Now, if it says, God formed his body out of the dirt of the earth and blew into his nostrils the spirit of life, and that's entirely different from the description of the creation of all other creatures, to say that Adam's development was the same as all the other creatures, not different in any way, it's just not giving the text its due. It's not paying any attention to what the text says. You say you don't know what blowing into his nostrils a soul of life means. There, from our point of view, since God is not a material being, it is definitely a metaphor. But it isn't just he threw the dice, or he set his computer on autopilot and let it play out anything he liked. No, it means he created man possessing some features that are directly analogous to divine features. As the Zohar comments, when a person exhales, he exhales from his insides. So the description of God as blowing into his nostrils a spirit of life or a breath of life is meant to convey that God created man with some features that are really essential to God, insofar as a creature can have those features. That's what it's meant to convey. So that's a piece of poetry that describes a reality that's based on the meaning of the poetry. It's not just a free association. So to put evolution here, as I said, for plants and for animals and for fish and for birds, I could hear it as a representation of the text. By the way, something that some people have pointed out, according to the Genesis story, plants arrive on day 3, and the sun gets put in its place in the heavens on day 4. That could be a problem for photosynthesis, hey? Don't know exactly what the condition of the world was before the sun got put in its place on day 4, but in the simple description of it, the natural picture is going to have some difficulty there, because you can't have plants without sunlight. At any rate, I think that there the text is going to be abandoned. As far as the rest of it is concerned, if you just dealt with the text, I myself took this position at one time because I was dealing with the text. Those who are the custodians of the tradition, about 6-7 years ago, came out with an authoritative opinion that the tradition will not tolerate that, the tradition as a whole. I have to be faithful to the tradition as a whole, so I gave that up. And now I take the position that I described to you, that events were compressed into a much shorter period of time, and this isn't a natural process at all. So that's what I think is. Now, I want to make one more philosophical remark, and then we can discuss things till 5:15 or quite early. So sometimes you hear people say this: okay, evolution has problems. There isn't enough evidence to accept it as true, and it's facing counterexamples and objections and so on and so on. But it's the only game in town. It's the only theory we have. Isn't it appropriate to accept a theory unless and until you have a better theory? Indeed, isn't that part of the procedure of science? You accept a theory until somebody proposes a better theory, and then you move to a better theory. Isn't that naturally reasonable, and isn't that really scientific? The answer is no on both counts. The answer is no on both counts. The fact that I have only one theory in the area does not mean that it's appropriate to believe the theory is true. If the theory is too poorly supported by the evidence, the correct thing to do is to just confess your ignorance. Let's suppose a murder is committed. I have only one suspect. He had a motive. But that's all. The only piece of evidence that I have is that he had a motive. Can you put him in jail? No, you cannot. He's my only suspect, my only theory. Yeah, but that's not a good enough reason to believe that he committed the murder. Because motive is too thin a piece of evidence to justify concluding that he committed the murder. Or even taking seriously that you might assign a detective to follow him or look for more evidence, but to conclude that he committed the murder? Surely not. When you have an area that needs to be explained, somebody proposes a theory and the probability of it is very, very low, then what the right thing to say is, the probability is so low that we just don't have any good answers to the question. And the same is true in science. There are times when people just throw up their hands and say, we don't know what to say because the evidence just isn't strong enough to justify any conclusion at all. And I think that's the attitude that we ought to take towards evolution. The evidence isn't strong enough to justify any conclusion at all. And that being the case, it's an interesting study and so on and so on. If it were followed consistently and honestly, that isn't always true. No side is always honest. I think that certainly shouldn't be concluded to be correct. By the way, I will say one where you did remark about the fossil record. I don't know to the extent to which you are aware, but the fossil record is known to be drastically incomplete. This is not news. Eldridge and Gould published their famous paper on punctuated equilibria in 1975 or 6 because it's incomplete, period. And they have to explain why it isn't complete. And they propose an explanation, and the explanation has its ups and downs, but everybody knows it's incomplete. It's incomplete in fairly minor transitions, and it's incomplete in gigantic transitions. Insects appear in the record wholly formed. Flowering plants appear in the record wholly formed, without any antecedents whatsoever. So there are gigantic gaps in the fossil record, and that has to be accounted for somehow. And people do work on that as to how to explain the gaps, but nobody thinks that that there are no gaps. The gaps are famous, and they're accepted. There's a gigantic controversy now about the Cambrian Explosion, and although the true believers in evolution are screaming bloody murder about it, the evidence is that it's a gigantic hole, and it's a hole that to date has not been plugged. There are a lot of them. Just give you the flavor of this punctuated equilibrium. It's gone through many incarnations. You're doing paleontology in the plains of Central Africa, and you find species of wildebeest, millions and millions of them, covering a large area. And you go down a million years, 2 million years, they look basically the same. Then you come to another layer, and there are substantial differences between them. Substantial differences. No in-betweens, no intermediaries. Darwin predicts that that's not going to happen. Darwin predicts that they're going to be very gradual changes for the reasons that I told you. Complicated thing, make a big change in it, it's going to go to pieces. What happened? So here was the first form of the theory. First form of the theory is large interconnected populations don't change. Only small isolated populations change. So now you have hundreds of miles of plains and millions of wildebeest. Nothing's going to happen. But there's a gigantic storm, and the wildebeest stampede in all directions, and there's a fairly high mountain pass in the region. 500 wildebeest stampede over this mountain pass, and when the storm clears a few days later, 500 of them find themselves in a small isolated valley. They don't remember the way back. They're wildebeest, right? Not 10-year-old kids who could certainly figure it out. They're stuck there, and the valley only has enough food for 500, so you have a constant population of 500 wildebeest. Now, in a small, isolated population, you now have the possibility of rapid evolution. Sharper hooves, better balance, faster running, better perception, better evasion. Why it happens in the valley, don't ask me. 200,000 years later, which in paleontology is a blink of an eye, there's an earthquake, and an opening appears in the mountain pass, and the valley is connected to the plains. And now the 500 new improved wildebeest appear on the plains, and they start competing, and eventually they take over, and they become the new species of wildebeest. When you're doing paleontology, are you going to find that little isolated valley? No, you're not. You're going to find the main population on the plains. And as you go down, first you find the new improved ones, and then you find the old ones. And there's substantial differences between them because you don't find the gradual changes. This is a way to save the idea of gradual changes. Yes, it was all gradual changes, just like Darwin said. It's just that it happens in such a way that you're not going to find it. Now, some people have puzzled about this. You have a theory that explains why you're not going to find evidence that the theory is true. Is that good? Is that good? Bad? Puzzling? Equivocal? Isn't it evidence that's the lifeblood of theories? Don't theories live because there's evidence for them? Now you have an evidence they have a theory that explains why we're not going to find the evidence that it's true. It's at least questionable. Should you accept the theory that explains why you won't find evidence? You know why your computer is failing? You're suffering espionage. But the spy who's tinkering with the computer is so perfectly careful, you'll never find it. Now, accept my theory, because you can't ever prove it wrong, because my theory is he's so good, you're never going to find him. I don't know. Many people are going to be uncomfortable with that. And people were uncomfortable with that. And Stephen Jay Gould, in his monumental book, The Structure of Evolutionary Theory, 1,400 pages of which I read the whole thing, knows this. He himself, with Niles Eldredge, created the theory of punctuated equilibria. And he says, we need some evidence that the punctuated equilibrium scenario took place, and maybe studies of gene frequency could give us some evidence. And he speculates this way and that way. Gould was really pretty good. So that's another example. That when you appeal to the fossil record, you have to know the fossil record has well-known, established gaps in it. By the way, I forgot to put something in before. I know I'm putting a footnote on a footnote on a footnote, but Stephen Jay Gould made the following remark in an article in a publication called Natural History. He said, the causes of changes within species are not the same as the causes of change from species to species. He said it definitively. I said it as a challenge. Show me they're the same. He said it definitively that they're not the same. They're not the same. The causes of changes within species are not the causes of change between species. He said the small does not integrate smoothly into the large. So I merely said there's no evidence that you can do it. Here's one of the world's experts on evolution who says you can't do it. So just citing changes in the color of the skin or other minor variations and saying, yeah, and a couple of billion of them take you from a mouse to an elephant is just a speculation. It's not something for which we really have evidence. Okay.